I wasn't looking for a pattern when I started reading newspaper archives from the 1870s. I was researching something else entirely, following up on construction records from American railroad expansion. Standard historical curiosity, the kind of thing you file away as isolated incidents and move on. But then I noticed the repetition. Not folklore, not campfire stories passed down through generations. Newspaper reports, published in respected papers, the New York Times, local dailies, county records, all documenting the same phenomenon across different states, all following the same basic structure. Farmer plows a field, workers excavate for a foundation, someone digs into a burial mound, and there, beneath feet of earth, skeletal remains measuring 7, 8, sometimes 9 feet or more. Not scattered bones, complete skeletons, often in organized burial sites, frequently accompanied by artifacts, copper ornaments, tools, ceremonial objects. And here's what made me stop. The decade of the 1870s represents something crucial. It's the period when these reports appear most frequently, most credibly, with the most verifiable details. Before the skepticism hardened, before the official dismissals began, before the records, quite suddenly, went silent. Let me show you what was documented before someone decided these discoveries should stop being news. The Public Ledger, August 25, 1870, Janesville, Wisconsin. The report describes a skeleton 13 feet in length, discovered during excavation work. Not an estimate, not folklore retold. A measurement, published in a newspaper that reported crop prices, election results, and local business transactions, with the same matter-of-fact tone. The account includes details that suggest the reporters considered this newsworthy, but not particularly shocking, as if discoveries of unusual skeletal remains were common enough to merit documentation, but not sensational enough to require elaborate justification. Compare this to how such a discovery would be treated today. The immediate skepticism, the demand for academic verification, the assumption of hoax or misidentification, the dismissal before investigation. But in 1870, the response was different. Document the find, measure the bones, report the facts, move on. What changed? When did extraordinary discoveries become unacceptable to report? And more importantly, why? January 13th, 1870, Wisconsin Decatur Republican, Potosi, Wisconsin. Workers digging the foundation of a sawmill near the Mississippi River uncovered 2 giant skeletons described as well-preserved and belonging to an unknown race. The bones were found together, buried deliberately in a location suggesting intentional burial rather than accidental deposition. The paper doesn't sensationalize. It reports the way it would report any other construction find, any other historical artifact, any other physical evidence uncovered during routine excavation work. And that's what strikes me most about the 1870s reports. They lack the breathless excitement you'd expect if these were considered impossible or shocking. They read like documentation of something unusual, but not unprecedented, as if the people of that era understood something we've forgotten, as if they operated under different assumptions about what was possible, what had existed, what the physical evidence suggested about the past. To understand why these reports appeared with such frequency in the 1870s, you need to understand what was happening across America during this period. Thousands of burial mounds dotted the landscape, earthwork structures, some massive in scale, built by cultures predating European contact. The Adena culture, the Hopewell tradition, the Mississippian civilization, sophisticated societies with extensive trade networks, astronomical knowledge, and engineering capabilities that rivaled anything in the Old World. But in the 1870s, the official narrative was different. The dominant theory suggested these mounds were built by a lost race, a vanished civilization, unrelated to contemporary Native American populations. Not because the evidence supported this, but because the alternative acknowledging indigenous sophistication, threatened the justification for westward expansion. This mound builder myth created a paradox. On one hand, it required accepting that an advanced civilization had existed and disappeared. On the other, it couldn't acknowledge that Native Americans represented the direct descendants of those builders. The giant skeleton reports fit perfectly into this contradiction. They suggested a physically different people, a race that no longer existed, evidence of something vanished, something other, something that could be studied without challenging the displacement of living indigenous populations. And so, for a brief window, these discoveries were documented, reported, archived, until they weren't. The Alabama Historical Society, 1876, Moundville excavations. Hezekiah Powell reported discovering the skeleton of a man that measured 9 feet from head to heel as he lay in the ground. Not measured standing, measured as it lay. The distinction matters. It suggests the skeleton was intact, undisturbed in its original burial position, that the measurement wasn't an estimate of how tall the person might have been, but a direct measurement of the bones as discovered. The report appears in the Alabama Historical Society records, an official historical organization, not a tabloid, not a sensationalist publication, an institution dedicated to documenting the archaeological and historical record of the state. These weren't amateur observations by untrained farmers making wild guesses. These were documented finds by people with institutional backing, people whose careers and reputations depended on accurate reporting. And yet, today, if you ask what happened to the 9-foot skeleton from Moundville, the answer is silence, not explanation, not clarification, not even acknowledgement that the report exists, just silence. Here's where the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Throughout the 1870s and into the following decades, newspaper reports consistently mention that discovered skeletal remains were sent to the Smithsonian Institution. Not sometimes, consistently, almost as if there was an established protocol. The Smithsonian's Bureau of American Ethnology actively encouraged those excavating mounds to send specimens for study. This is documented. The institution was building a collection, gathering physical evidence from across the continent, centralizing the archaeological record in Washington. Between 1881 and 1894, Cyrus Thomas led extensive Smithsonian-funded excavations of burial mounds. His work culminated in a 700-page report that definitively proved Native Americans had built the earthworks. This was important scientific work that dismantled racist pseudoscience about lost white civilizations. But here's what's strange. Thomas's report documents many skeletal discoveries. It describes burial practices, artifact placement, mound construction techniques. It provides meticulous detail about excavation methodology. What it doesn't provide is comprehensive skeletal measurements. Not consistently, not systematically, not in ways that would allow verification of the newspaper claims about unusual size. The Smithsonian collected over 18,000 skeletal remains from Native American burial sites. Before the 1990 Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, forced repatriation, that's documented. The bones existed. They were cataloged. They were studied. But when asked specifically about giant remains, the institution's response has been consistent. No such skeletons exist in our collections. Never did. The newspaper reports were mistakes, hoaxes, misidentifications of animal bones, every single one of them, across decades, from multiple sources, all wrong. That's the official position. Something about the 1870s created conditions where these reports appeared with unusual frequency. It wasn't the beginning. Reports of unusual skeletal remains date back to the late 1700s, but the 1870s represent a peak, a moment when documentation was systematic enough to seem credible, but before the institutional gatekeeping that would later prevent such reports from reaching print. The decade preceded the 1887 passage of the Dawes Act, which began the systematic destruction of remaining indigenous landholdings. It preceded the final military campaigns that would force the last independent Native American nations onto reservations. It preceded the full consolidation of American territorial expansion. In other words, the 1870s were a brief window when reporting on archaeological anomalies didn't yet carry the political weight it would soon assume. When discoveries could be documented without immediately triggering questions about what those discoveries meant for ongoing colonial projects. And perhaps that's why, after the 1870s, the nature of these reports begins to change. They become less frequent, more skeptical, more quickly dismissed. By the 1920s, they've almost entirely disappeared from mainstream publications. Not because discoveries stopped, but because they stopped being considered newsworthy, or more accurately, they stopped being considered acceptable. What gets overlooked in discussions of giant skeleton reports is what was buried with them. The 1870s newspaper accounts consistently describe elaborate burial practices, copper, ornaments, ceremonial weapons, tools of unusual size and sophistication, grave goods that suggested social stratification, specialized roles, technological knowledge. In Chillicothe, Ohio, workers uncovered a skeleton wearing copper armor, its mouth stuffed with pearls. The description appears in the Smithsonian's own Bureau of Ethnology reports. Not folklore, official archaeological documentation. What gets overlooked in discussions of giant skeleton reports is what was buried with them. The 1870s newspaper accounts consistently describe elaborate burial practices, copper ornaments, ceremonial weapons, tools of unusual size and sophistication, grave goods that suggested social stratification, specialized roles, technological knowledge. In Chillicothe, Ohio, workers uncovered a skeleton wearing copper armor, its mouth stuffed with pearls. The description appears in the Smithsonian's own Bureau of Ethnology reports. Not folklore, official archaeological documentation. In Georgia, excavations funded by the Smithsonian uncovered a stone vault containing a skeleton measuring 7 feet 2 inches, buried with a copper crown. The report stated, all the relics were carefully packed and sent to the Smithsonian Institution and are said to be the most interesting collection ever found in America. Where is that collection today? Where is the copper crown? Where are the carefully packed relics that were considered the most interesting finds in American archaeology? The Smithsonian doesn't say. The records don't explain. The artifacts have vanished, along with the bones. And that's what makes this more than just a question about skeletal measurements. It's a question about material culture, about burial practices, about what the complete archaeological context suggested before that context was separated, dispersed, or destroyed. Not all the discoveries in the 1870s went straight to museums. Some were examined locally, by physicians, by anatomists, by people with medical training who could distinguish human bones from animal remains. The New York Times, December 25, 1868. Reprinted from the Sauk Rapids Sentinel. A skeleton discovered in Minnesota, examined by multiple members of the medical faculty in Nashville, pronounced unequivocally by all, the skeleton of a huge man. These weren't farmers making guesses. These were physicians, people trained in human anatomy, people whose professional reputations required accurate assessment. The article describes the finder being offered $8,000 for the specimen, but choosing to exhibit it for 12 months before considering sale. This wasn't someone trying to hide evidence or perpetrate a hoax. This was someone treating the discovery as a valuable scientific specimen. What happened to that skeleton after the exhibition period? The record doesn't say. Like so many others from the 1870s, it disappears from documentation. But before it disappeared, it was examined, verified, declared human by medical professionals. That matters. By 1934, the institutional response to giant skeleton claims had solidified. Alesh Hrdlichka, curator of anthropology at the Smithsonian, published a formal rejection of the existence of any race of giants between 7 to 8 feet tall. He attributed the newspaper reports to the will to believe, combined with amateur anthropologists unfamiliar with human anatomy. His explanation: people misidentified extinct megafauna as human remains. Mastodon bones, arranged in certain ways, could appear humanoid. Measurements were exaggerated. The whole phenomenon was a combination of hoaxes, mistakes, and wishful thinking. This became the official position, not just of the Smithsonian, but of academic archaeology generally. And with that declaration, the conversation ended. Not through debate, not through systematic re-examination of the evidence, through institutional authority, declaring the question settled. But here's what Hrdlička's explanation doesn't address: the medical examinations by trained physicians, the Smithsonian's own early reports documenting unusual skeletal remains, the consistency of the newspaper accounts across different regions and time periods, the artifacts found with the bones that suggested deliberate burial of human individuals, not random assemblages of animal bones. His dismissal required treating hundreds of documented reports from multiple independent sources across decades, all as uniformly wrong. And perhaps they were. Perhaps every farmer, every construction worker, every local doctor, every newspaper reporter who documented these discoveries was mistaken. Or perhaps the institutional explanation serves a different purpose than historical accuracy.